Now, the way we consume our daily news is changing with a growing generational divide. Nowadays, younger voters are relying less on newspapers and more on the internet and social media. But does that make them more prone to so-called fake news? Our media editor, Amol Rajan, has been finding out.
Yes, it's Fleet Street. But how many of you know the inside story on the stories you read?
Once home to Britain's newspapers, for decades Fleet Street provided the lifeblood of our body politic. Those are vanished times, of course, thanks to the digital revolution. But for all the talk of the death of papers, the presses are still rolling. Read by nearly 8 million people in Britain every day, papers often set the wider news agenda. These days, the Daily Telegraph is much more than just a newspaper. But in its printed form, it still boasts nearly 500,000 readers, the majority of them Conservative inclined, with an average age of 57.
If we wield any influence, it's because of the influence of our readers, and we're lucky to have many of them, and many of them are influential. It's true that print circulation is in decline somewhat, but we still sell more than 450,000 newspapers every day.
Even as their print circulations fall and they move online, titles like the mighty Telegraph still wield enormous influence and have a hotline to number 10. But there is another conversation going on during this election, one in which websites with a very different following tell a very different story. One such website is Squawkbox. Its anonymous author, a hard-left member of the Labour Party and pressure group Momentum, spoke to us on the condition that we would preserve his anonymity, saying he operates below the radar of traditional media and fears for his family's safety. Many of his articles go viral, with some achieving hundreds of thousands of readers.
The way that social media works, in Facebook more than Twitter, is that you've got this kind of deal, these Venn diagrams, the overlapping circles of people's spheres of influence and acquaintance. And that person might be somebody you're already preaching to the choir, but their auntie or uncle who sees their Facebook feed might not be, their friend that they're connected to from work. And it's that overspill around the edges of people's social media circles that interests me, because that's where the message gets out and you get a chance to actually change opinion.
With a lot of these sites that are popping up, their entire purpose is to destroy the status quo. They don't want to give a fair hearing to both sides. They don't want to engage with the opposition. They don't want to have the relationships that journalists traditionally do with politicians. Their entire purpose is to smash the system.
In the UK, the older you are, the more likely you are to get most of your news from TV. But a comparison of print and online shows a growing generation divide. The younger you are, the greater the dependence on the internet for news. 84% of young people mostly get their news online, with social media playing a key role. Just 4% of the same age range turn to newspapers first.
The headlines are fairly sensationalist, they're fairly emotionally charged.
In analysis published this evening, researchers at the Oxford Internet Institute conclude that so far British voters are getting less false or misleading news on Twitter than Americans saw in last year's presidential election.
It's not as big of a problem as it was in the States. We found that in the lead up to this election, people are sharing quality news, so news from professional news organisations, and that's 53% of the total content shared. Junk news has been around 13%, so a big difference there.
Social media have created echo chambers where younger and often left-leaning audiences find an alternative news agenda. The balance of power within the news ecosystem is shifting their way, even though many politicians are yet to realise. Amol Rajan, BBC News.